hall was one of the most well-known places on the planet. Everyone had seen it at least once on television or in news clips. It was the kind of place where world leaders gathered, where important talks happened, and where people spoke on behalf of their nations. The building itself stood tall with glass walls that reflected the sky, and each time sunlight hit it, the whole structure looked like it was glowing from within. But even with all its importance, something inside that hall always felt strangely incomplete. Right at the front, where the main stage was raised, there were seats arranged in a long curve. Each seat had a nameplate in front of it. Some showed countries, some showed groups, some showed organizations. But there was one seat that always caught the eye of anyone who looked at the stage for more than a moment. It was placed slightly forward, almost like it was invited to speak before anyone else. The nameplate in front of it carried only one word: Earth. And even though that seat had been placed there many years ago, no one had ever sat in it. It remained untouched, unmoved, and unchanged, as if it belonged to no one and everyone at the same time. People had grown used to seeing the chair empty. Whenever the camera moved across the hall, the empty seat appeared for a second or two. Some people noticed it, some didn't, and some simply assumed it was part of the design. But there were a few individuals who looked at that seat and felt something strange. They wondered why Earth had a place but no voice. They wondered who was supposed to sit there, and why no one ever tried. Among them was a quiet observer who had attended the gathering for the first time. They had come as part of a research team, mostly to take notes and watch from a distance. The work was simple, and the expectations were even simpler. But when they entered the hall, and their eyes fell on the empty seat, they felt a small pull of curiosity, as if something inside them had been waiting to notice it. As the event began, leaders took turns speaking. They talked about trade, climate, cooperation, disagreements, promises, and plans. The hall echoed with applause at times and silence at others. The observer continued to take notes, just like they were supposed to, but their eyes kept drifting toward that single empty chair. It stood there like a quiet reminder of something unsaid. At one point during the break, the cameras were turned off and people began walking around. Reporters rushed to different corners of the hall to interview officials. Assistants moved quickly to prepare documents for the next session. The observer walked closer to the stage, slowly, carefully, trying not to look too curious. They stood near the side, looking up at the empty chair, wondering what it meant. One of the older staff members noticed them staring and smiled lightly, as if they had seen that expression on many faces before. "You're looking at the Earth seat," the staff member said in a calm tone. The observer nodded. "It's always been empty," the staff member continued, "since the day they placed it here." "Why?" the observer asked. The staff member shrugged. "No one really knows who should sit there. Or maybe no one wants that responsibility." And with that simple answer, the staff member walked away, leaving the observer with even more questions than before. For the rest of the day, the observer couldn't shake the feeling that the empty seat wasn't just a piece of furniture. It felt like a message. But a message from who? And for whom? They looked around at the people in the room. Everyone was busy with their own tasks. Everyone was speaking on behalf of something or someone. But no one was speaking on behalf of Earth itself. No one ever did. The event ended, and the hall slowly emptied. The bright lights dimmed, the screens went dark, and the sound of footsteps faded into the echo of the large building. The observer stood for a moment near the exit, looking back at the stage. The empty seat was still there, untouched, unnoticed, but somehow, in that quiet moment, it seemed louder than all the speeches given that day. When they returned home that night, the image of the seat replayed in their mind like a memory that refused to rest. They remembered how the cameras had captured it earlier, how the room had moved around it, how leaders had spoken in front of it but never toward it. They thought about the staff members' words, No one wants that responsibility. And they wondered if that was true, or if people simply assumed someone else was supposed to take it. Days passed, but the thought didn't fade. The observer found old pictures and videos from past events, and each one showed the same thing, the empty chair, unchanged, year after year. It was like a symbol that everyone accepted without question. A symbol that Earth didn't have one voice, or couldn't have one, or shouldn't have one, yet something felt off about that idea. Because Earth wasn't just countries and leaders. It was people. Ordinary people. People who lived in small homes and busy apartments. People who worked long hours. People who studied, taught, cared, built, and dreamed. People who lived their lives one day at a time without ever stepping into a place like that hall. And maybe, just maybe, those people were meant to fill that seat in some way. One afternoon, while reviewing some recordings, the observer paused a video at a moment where sunlight had hit the chair, making it stand out more than ever. The rest of the stage seemed dim, while the chair glowed with a soft brightness. It felt almost symbolic, like Earth itself was waiting for something or someone. The observer didn't share these thoughts with anyone. Not at first. It didn't seem like something worth mentioning. It felt like a small curiosity, a personal question, not a public one. But the more they watched, the more they thought about the simple fact that no one had dared to sit in that chair. People were waiting for permission, for authority, for approval, for some kind of rule book that didn't exist. And maybe that was the problem. Maybe people believed they were too small to speak for something so big. Maybe they felt they had no right. Maybe the world had taught them that representation belonged only to power, not to ordinary lives. One evening, while walking through a busy street filled with noise and movement, the observer looked at the people around them. Children laughing, vendors calling out prices, workers carrying bags, elderly people walking slowly, young people talking with excitement about their future. Every face held a piece of Earth's story. Every life carried a part of Earth's experience. None of them would ever be invited to sit in a hall like that. Yet all of them were the reason the hall existed in the first place. The observer realized something simple but powerful. Earth's seat was empty, not because no one cared. It was empty because people believed they needed permission to care loudly. They believed they needed authority to speak. They believed someone else should do it for them. But what if that wasn't true? What if the seat was meant to remind everyone that Earth's voice wasn't supposed to come from one person, but from many? And what if that seat remained empty, not because humanity lacked a representative, but because humanity itself was the representative? That night, the observer sat at a desk, opened a blank document, and began writing down their thoughts. They didn't know what it would lead to, or if anyone would ever read it. But they wrote anyway. They wrote about the empty seat. They wrote about the people in the hall. They wrote about the people on the street. And they wrote about the idea that Earth didn't need one person to speak for it. Earth had billions of voices already living on it. And maybe, someday, those voices would realize they never needed permission to be heard. The days after the event passed slowly, but the thought of the empty chair stayed with the researcher like a quiet echo. They tried to focus on their regular work, but each time they read a new document or watched a new recording, their mind went back to the same question. Why was Earth's seat always empty? Was it truly because no one could sit there, or because everyone assumed someone else should? The researcher had access to old files, so they began reading about how the seat was added to the hall years ago. It was a surprise to find out that the seat was not originally part of the design. It had been added later, after a long discussion among different groups. Some believed that Earth should be represented not only by nations, but also by a symbol that stood above borders. Others thought it was unnecessary. In the end, the seat was placed there, but no rule was made about who should sit in it. Maybe they thought the answer would reveal itself over time. But time passed, and nothing changed. The more the researcher read, the more puzzled they became. Something about the way people talked about the seat in old documents felt hesitant, unsure. It was almost as if they didn't want to decide, because deciding might upset someone. So instead, they left the seat open, thinking it was the safer choice. And that decision turned into silence that lasted many years. One afternoon, while reading through an old archive, the researcher came across a short interview clip of a former official. In the clip, the official was asked why the Earth seat remained empty. The official gave a small laugh and said, "Who can speak for everyone? Better to leave it empty than cause an argument." That sentence stayed with the researcher long after the video ended. They thought about it while riding the train home. They thought about it while standing in line for food. They thought about it while watching families walk together in the evening light. People disagreed on many things. That was true. But was that a reason for silence? Was avoiding conflict the same as avoiding responsibility? That night, the researcher opened their laptop and wrote a few lines about what they had found. But the words didn't feel enough. They needed to know what ordinary people thought, not officials, not experts, not historians, just everyday people. So the next morning, the researcher stepped outside with a notebook and began asking people a simple question. If there was a seat for Earth, who do you think should sit in it? The responses were interesting, sometimes funny, sometimes serious, but always honest. A street vendor laughed and said, "Not me. I have enough trouble speaking for my own family." A student shrugged and said, "Maybe a teacher? Or a scientist? Someone smart." An old man smiled and said, "Earth doesn't need one person talking for it. We all do in our own way." A shop worker frowned thoughtfully and said, "Maybe someone kind. That's more important than anything else." The researcher wrote down every answer. None of the people seemed to think they were allowed to sit in such a seat. They spoke about leaders, experts, famous people, anyone but themselves. The idea of sitting in a chair that represented Earth felt impossible to them, almost foolish. Yet each person's answer showed something meaningful. Everyone had a thought, a feeling, a small piece of wisdom. Later, the researcher walked to a small park to sit and read through their notes. The sound of children playing, the rustle of trees, and the distant noise of cars all blended together into a familiar harmony of everyday life. It was a simple moment, but it reminded them that Earth was not made up of speeches and ceremonies. It was made up of people living ordinary days. The researcher realized that perhaps the seat was empty because people believed they weren't important enough to fill it. Maybe they thought the right to speak for Earth belonged only to those with titles or power. But the truth felt different. Earth's story wasn't shaped only by leaders. It was shaped by workers, families, students, travelers, and dreamers. It was shaped by love, mistakes, hope, and effort. And all of that came from ordinary lives. For the next few days, the researcher continued their small survey, asking people wherever they went. Some were in a hurry and gave short replies. Some were curious and asked questions in return. Some spoke quietly, as if worried their answer might sound wrong. But the pattern stayed the same. Everyone felt too small for such a big responsibility. One evening, while taking the bus home, the researcher looked around at the tired faces of people returning from work. Some leaned against windows with half-closed eyes. Some checked their phones. Some stared out into the moving streets. These were the people who fixed things, cleaned things, built things, cared for others, and kept life moving. Yet none of them believed their voice had the weight to represent. It made the researcher wonder how long people had lived with this quiet belief that they needed someone else to speak for them. It felt like a misunderstanding that had lasted too long. A few days later, the researcher returned to the hall where the global event had taken place. This time, the building was almost empty. The floors echoed under quiet footsteps. The stage was clean, the seats neatly arranged, and everything felt still. The Earth seat looked exactly the same as before, polished, untouched. Waiting. The researcher stood in front of it for a long moment. They imagined the countless eyes that had looked at it over the years. They imagined how many people had wondered what it meant. For the first time, the researcher reached out and lightly touched the back of the chair. It felt smooth and cold, like something distant yet familiar. Standing there, the researcher realized that the seat was more than an empty chair. It was a mirror. It reflected the hesitation of humanity, the quiet belief that ordinary people were not allowed to represent something as large as Earth. It reflected years of waiting for someone else to step forward. Someone perfect. Someone powerful. Someone approved. But no such person had ever appeared. And maybe none ever would. The researcher stepped back and imagined the seat during past events. Leaders had spoken loudly on the stage, but none had ever turned to the chair or acknowledged it directly. It was there, but it was invisible. And somehow, that invisibility made it even louder. A security guard walked past and gave a friendly nod. "You're looking at the Earth seat again," he said with a small smile. "People always stare at it when the hall is empty." The researcher nodded. "Why do you think no one sits in it?" The guard thought for a moment. "Maybe because sitting there means you're speaking for everyone." "That's a heavy thing to carry." "It is," the researcher agreed. "But," the guard added, "I think anyone who cares enough could sit there." "People don't realize that." The guard walked away, leaving the researcher with a quiet thought. Anyone who cared enough. That simple idea suddenly felt powerful. On the way home, the researcher kept turning those words over in their mind. Care was something that did not require permission. It did not require status or position. Care came from being human. And if care was enough to sit in that seat, then maybe the world had misunderstood the meaning of the chair from the beginning. That night, the researcher wrote down everything they had seen, heard, and felt. They wrote about the old documents, the answers from ordinary people, the conversation with the guard, and the moment they touched the seat. The writing flowed naturally, as if the thoughts were waiting for a place to land. The more they wrote, the clearer the idea became. The seat wasn't empty because humanity lacked a representative. It was empty because humanity didn't realize it was allowed to represent itself. People were waiting for permission that was never needed. In the quiet of that night, as the lights of the city flickered outside the window, the researcher felt a small shift inside. A shift from curiosity to purpose. Maybe their job wasn't just to take notes or observe. Maybe their job was to help people see something they had overlooked for too long. The Earth seat was not a symbol of silence. It was a reminder that every human being had the right to care, speak, and be heard. The empty seat wasn't a sign of absence. It was an invitation, and someday someone would accept it. The researcher didn't plan to start anything. They simply wanted answers, but sometimes answers create paths people didn't expect. After days of talking to everyday people, watching old footage, and thinking deeply about the empty Earth seat, something inside them shifted. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a quiet understanding that grew slowly, like a light appearing in a dim room. One night, when the world outside was calm, the researcher opened their laptop and began typing a simple message. It wasn't meant to be a speech or a statement. It was just a thought they needed to share. They wrote, "Earth's seat is empty because we think we need permission to fill it." They read the line several times, unsure if anyone would care. But after a few moments of hesitation, they posted it online. At first, the message didn't attract much attention. A few people liked it. A few commented, and most simply scrolled past it. The researcher didn't expect anything more. They believed it would fade into the endless stream of online posts. But something unexpected happened the next day. More people started sharing it, not because they saw the researcher as someone important, but because the words felt real to them. They felt simple, honest, understandable. And they touched something many had felt but never spoken by the end of the week. Hundreds of people had shared the post. Then thousands. People commented on how they had seen the empty seat in broadcasts, but never questioned it. Others talked about how they always felt too small to speak up about things that mattered. Some shared stories about moments when they wished they had spoken, but fear or doubt held them back. The researcher read each message carefully. Some were heartfelt, some were frustrated, some were hopeful, and some were confused. But all of them had one thing in common. They came from people who felt unheard. Soon, people started adding their own thoughts to the conversation. Someone wrote, "Maybe we don't need one person for that seat. Maybe the seat is a reminder that we all matter." Another person wrote, "We wait for permission our whole lives, without realizing we already have a voice." A young person said, "I used to think the world never cared what I had to say. Maybe that was my mistake." The researcher didn't reply to every message, but they read everything and felt a growing sense of responsibility. Not in a heavy or frightening way, but in a way that felt human. People were connecting to a simple idea that they didn't need to be powerful to care. That their thoughts weren't too small to matter. That Earth belonged to all of them, not just those who stood on stages. Soon, short videos began appearing online. A teacher from a small town spoke about kindness. A baker talked about helping neighbors. A taxi driver filmed a short clip about what unity meant to him. A group of students shared a message about protecting the planet. None of the videos were fancy or professional. They were real. They were human. They came from people living ordinary lives. People began using a simple phrase in their posts. "I speak for Earth in my own way." Some wrote it under pictures. Some wrote it under daily stories. Some wrote it on paper and held it up in videos. It wasn't a campaign. It wasn't a movement started by any organization. It was something that grew naturally, like plants finding sunlight. The researcher never imagined their single sentence would travel so far, but it did. And each day, more people joined the conversation. Not because they wanted attention, but because the idea made them feel connected. For once, people weren't divided by titles, positions, or backgrounds. They were united by the simplest of feelings, the desire to be acknowledged. At work, colleagues began asking the researcher about the message. Some were curious, some were amused, and some were genuinely moved. One person said, "I saw your post. It made me think about my own life. I realized I often stay quiet even when I shouldn't." Another said, "It feels strange, doesn't it? The idea that we were waiting for permission we never needed." The researcher felt humbled. They weren't a leader or a speaker. They were just someone who had noticed something others overlooked. But sometimes noticing is enough to start a spark. A few days later, the researcher decided to walk through the city to see how people were reacting in real life. They expected nothing unusual, but small changes were everywhere. In a cafe, two people were discussing the idea of ordinary voices. At a bus stop, someone was reading a post about the Earth seat. At a bookstore, a young person was quietly writing something on a notepad, glancing at their phone where the researcher's message was visible. The researcher sat on a bench in a busy street, watching life move around them. People buying groceries, children laughing on sidewalks, workers hurrying to jobs, street artists painting small boards. These people were Earth, not the leaders in the hall, not the officials reading documents. Earth was made of millions of small stories happening every day. And somehow, The empty seat had brought those stories together. One evening, while checking messages, the researcher found something surprising. A person from another country had posted a video saying, "Maybe the seat was never meant for one person. Maybe it is a reminder that we share this world. When we act kindly, we are already speaking for Earth." The message was simple, but it touched thousands. Comments followed. "I feel the same. This makes me feel seen. I thought I had nothing to offer, but maybe I do. We don't need permission to care." The researcher watched these comments with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. They hadn't created this movement. People had created it themselves, using a thought that resonated deep inside. A few days later, someone suggested holding a small gathering in a public park where people could share their thoughts. The researcher wasn't sure about attending. They didn't want to be treated like a leader, because they didn't feel like one. But something in them said they should go not to speak for others, but to listen. When they reached the park, they were surprised to see many people sitting in a circle, talking softly. There were students, workers, elders, teenagers, parents with young kids. No one was giving orders. No one was standing above others. Everyone took turns speaking about what they cared about: helping neighbors, supporting fairness, protecting nature, treating people with respect, understanding differences. The researcher listened quietly as stories flowed like gentle rivers, stories of struggle, growth, hope, regret, and simple goodness. They realized that Earth already had countless voices. The empty seat in that hall wasn't a sign of silence. It was a sign of potential that had always existed. As the sun began to set, one person said something that stayed with the researcher long after the gathering ended. They said, "We may not sit in that hall, but we live on the same Earth. We can speak for it just by living with care. Maybe the seat is empty because it belongs to all of us." Those words echoed in the researcher's mind as they walked home. The movement that had started so quietly was turning into something beautiful. Not loud, not forceful, not political, but human, genuine, full of real voices. That night, the researcher wrote again, not a message to start anything new, but a reflection on what they had witnessed. They wrote about people finding courage in small places, about kindness being more powerful than speeches, about how simple ideas can grow when they touch the heart. They realized the world didn't need a single representative. What it needed was awareness that every voice mattered. Every choice mattered. Every act of care mattered. People didn't need permission to represent Earth. They only needed to believe they were worthy of doing so. And slowly, step by step, humanity began believing. The global event was announced weeks before it happened, but this time, the feeling in the air was different. People were not only talking about the usual topics that filled news broadcasts. They were also talking about the empty Earth seat, the same seat that had become a quiet symbol across the world. The conversation that had started with a single message had now reached places the researcher never imagined. Cafe tables, classrooms, street corners, online groups, workplaces everywhere. People were asking one question: if the seat belongs to all of us, why do we treat it like it belongs to no one? The researcher tried not to overthink it. They continued their daily work, did their research, and lived their life quietly. They didn't want to walk into the event with expectations. But inside, they felt something building, a kind of soft pressure in their chest. Not fear, not excitement. Something in between. Something like standing at the edge of a moment you don't fully understand yet. On the morning of the event, the researcher woke early and looked out the window. The sky was pale blue with thin clouds drifting slowly. It looked peaceful, but the whole world seemed awake. After getting ready, they took a long breath and made their way toward the hall. The same hall they had visited many times before, but today it felt different. Security was tighter. The crowd outside was larger. and the noise of people talking blended into a low hum that filled the air. Reporters held cameras and microphones. Interviewers asked questions, and people gathered in groups, holding signs with soft messages like "Every voice matters" and "We care." None of the signs looked angry or demanding. They looked hopeful. Inside the hall, the lights were bright, and the seats were filling up quickly. Leaders took their places, officials whispered to each other, and the stage was set exactly like before. And there it was, the Earth seat, empty, untouched, shining under the lights, like it was waiting for something. The researcher took a seat near the middle, close enough to see the stage clearly, but far enough to blend in with the crowd. They watched the chair carefully, wondering if anything would happen. Part of them hoped someone might walk up to it, but another part knew that wasn't likely. People were still shy, still unsure, still thinking someone else should stand first. The event began with the usual opening speeches. Leaders spoke about cooperation, progress, and global goals. Each speech was polished, practiced, perfect. But for some reason, the words felt different this time. Not wrong, just distant. Like something important was missing. As the speeches continued, a quiet shift began in the audience. It started with one person standing up from the back row. They didn't shout. They simply spoke in a normal, steady voice. And somehow the microphone caught it. "I don't want to interrupt," the person said, "but I want to say something small." People turned to look. The officials on stage paused, confused. But the person continued. "I'm just someone who works in a small shop," they said. "I'm not a leader. I'm not an expert. But I care about this world. And I think care should count." Their voice wasn't loud, but it reached every corner of the hall. A kind of hush fell over the room, the kind that happens when something unexpected but meaningful occurs. Before anyone could respond, another person stood up on the other side of the hall. "I want to say something too," they said softly. "I'm a parent. I teach my children to be kind. Maybe that's also a way of speaking for Earth." People glanced at each other. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Then another person stood, and another, and another. A young worker spoke about helping his neighborhood. A student talked about fairness. An elderly woman spoke about her hope for future generations. Each person spoke with their own voice, their own stories, their own emotions. None of them raised their tone. None demanded attention. They simply spoke as humans, and something incredible happened. The room didn't descend into chaos. It didn't become messy or loud. Instead, it felt calm, almost peaceful, like everyone had been waiting for this moment without knowing it. The officials on stage exchanged confused but thoughtful glances. This wasn't planned. This wasn't part of the schedule. Yet no one seemed willing to stop it. Even the security personnel hesitated, unsure of what to do. After all, these weren't protests or arguments. These were ordinary people speaking from the heart. The researcher watched the scene unfold with wide eyes. They had never imagined something like this would happen. The quiet movement that grew from their message had turned into a moment of truth. A moment where people finally felt brave enough to speak without permission. And then, something even more surprising occurred. Several people from the crowd turned their eyes toward the researcher. Some recognized them from the online posts. Others had seen interviews or comments connected to their message. It started with one person gently gesturing toward them. Then another. Then several more. "You should speak," someone whispered from behind. "You started this," another person said softly. "You don't have to be perfect," someone added. "Just be honest." The researcher felt their heart race. They didn't want to be seen as a leader or a symbol. They were just someone who noticed the empty seat. But now they stood up slowly, pushed forward not by force, but by the quiet encouragement of people who believed they should be heard. Walking toward the stage, the researcher felt the weight of thousands of eyes. Their hands shook slightly, but their steps were steady. When they reached the platform, they didn't sit in the Earth seat. They stood beside it. The hall went silent. The researcher took a breath and let the words come naturally, without planning, without fear. "I never thought this would happen," they began softly. "I never thought so many people would care about a simple seat. But now I understand something. This chair was never meant for someone special. It was never meant for one person or one authority." The researcher placed their hand lightly on the back of the chair. "This seat is empty because Earth isn't represented by one person. Earth is represented by all of you. Every kind act, every honest voice, every brave moment you already speak for this planet." Faces in the crowd softened. Some nodded, some smiled, some wiped tears quietly. "We've spent years thinking we needed permission," the researcher continued. "Permission to care, permission to speak, permission to matter. But we never needed it. Not then, not now." They stepped aside so the chair was fully visible to the hall. "This seat is a reminder," they said gently. "A reminder that every human being has a voice. You don't need to sit here to represent Earth. You represent it every day by how you live." There was no applause at first. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was powerful, like the world was absorbing each word with full attention. Then slowly, softly, the room filled with a warm wave of clapping, not loud or wild, but heartfelt. People stood up, not to praise the researcher, but to honor the truth of the moment. The researcher stepped down from the platform, feeling lighter, almost peaceful. As they walked back to their seat, people reached out to touch their arm, pat their shoulder, or simply smile. It wasn't admiration. They were sharing gratitude, understanding, connection. And as the event slowly continued, something had clearly changed. The empty Earth seat no longer looked lonely or forgotten. It felt alive, almost glowing, filled with the voices of everyone who had spoken that. It remained empty, but not silent. That it remained empty, but not meaningless. Because now the world understood. Earth didn't need one representative. Earth needed all of humanity to believe. It never needed permission to speak, to care, or to act. And in that hall, on that day, the meaning of the empty seat finally changed forever. The days after that meeting felt different around the world, even though nothing big changed on the outside. People still woke up early for work, still sat in traffic, still cooked dinner in small kitchens, still helped children get ready for school. Life continued in the same rhythm, but something inside many people felt lighter, almost like a door that had been locked for years finally opened. They did not know exactly what had changed, but they felt it. News channels kept showing clips from the International Hall. Some replayed the moment when people stood up without fear. Some showed the empty Earth seat glowing softly under the lights. Reporters from different countries used different words, but the message was the same. They said the world had witnessed something rare, something honest, something that did not come from leaders or officials, but from ordinary people. The researcher woke up the next morning without realizing that millions had watched them speak. They did not think of themselves as someone special. They only felt tired, like someone who had been carrying a heavy thought for too long and finally put it down. They walked to a small shop for breakfast. The person behind the counter noticed them and nodded with a calm smile. They did not ask for photos or interviews. They simply said the meeting yesterday was meaningful and that the empty seat finally made sense. The researcher thanked them and moved on, feeling grateful that people understood the message on their own. Around the world, the quiet movement continued to grow, but not in loud or dramatic ways. It grew in the soft, steady choices people made every day. A teacher in a small town added a short moment in class for students to share thoughts about kindness. A worker in a busy market helped an older person carry heavy bags, even though no one was recording it. A student in a crowded city picked up trash from a sidewalk without waiting for someone else to do it. These small actions were not connected by any leader or organization. They were connected only by the understanding that humanity did not need permission to care for each other. The empty earth seat began appearing in art, conversations, and even children's drawings. Some drew it with a bright light behind it. Some drew people standing around it, holding hands. Some simply drew the chair alone, but peaceful. These drawings appeared in schools, newspapers, and social posts from different parts of the world. It reminded people that the message was simple. No one person could sit there, because everyone belonged to that seat in their own way. Governments did not change overnight, but they noticed the shift. Meetings became a little calmer, debates a little more patient. Officials realized that people were watching differently now. They were not just watching for mistakes or promises. They were watching to see if leaders remembered that the empty chair symbolized ordinary people who wanted fairness and understanding. Slowly, some leaders began leaving small pauses in their speeches before making decisions, almost like they were giving space for the earth seat to speak, even though it had no voice. The researcher received invitations for interviews, speeches, and conferences, but they refused most of them. They felt the message belonged to everyone, not to one person. Instead, they continued visiting small communities, listening more than talking. They spoke to farmers who worked long hours in the sun, to shop workers who spent their days on their feet, to students who dreamed of better futures. They heard stories of struggle, hope, tiredness, and courage. Every story reminded them that the seat had been empty for a reason. It was never meant for one person to fill. It was meant to remind the world that every voice mattered, even the quiet ones. One afternoon, the researcher visited a small coastal town. The wind blew from the sea, carrying the sound of waves crashing gently on the shore. A group of young people were sitting on a low wall, painting a large mural on a building. The mural showed the earth seat with a soft glow around it, but instead of a single person standing near it, the painting showed many people from different walks of life surrounding it. When the researcher asked what inspired them, one of the artists said that they did not want the world to forget the message when the excitement faded. They wanted something permanent to stay on the wall, so people passing by would always remember that the seat belonged to everyone. The researcher stood in front of the mural for a long time. They felt a deep sense of peace. They realized the world did not need a hero or a leader to make change. It needed reminders that people could rise on their own. The mural was one of those reminders. Months passed, and life settled again into normal rhythms. The empty earth seat remained in the International Hall, never touched and never assigned. But now, whenever cameras showed it, people understood it differently. They no longer wondered who should sit there. They understood it as a symbol of responsibility shared by all. Some people wrote letters to the hall, saying the seat gave them hope. Others sent small handmade items, poems, or drawings. The hall kept them in a quiet gallery, open to anyone who wanted to see. Visitors often walked through the gallery in silence. Many came out with thoughtful faces, as if the simple objects reminded them that humanity was not powerless. The researchers sometimes visited the gallery too. They felt humbled reading messages from people they had never met. One message came from a worker who said they had always felt invisible, but the empty seat reminded them that their voice mattered just as much as anyone else's. Another message came from a child who wrote that they wanted to grow up and protect the planet because the seat made them feel responsible in a good way. Researchers sat on a bench in the gallery one day, thinking about everything that had happened. They realized that the world had not changed because someone gave a great speech. It changed because people heard something simple, something that had always been true but rarely spoken out loud. humanity never needed permission to care, to speak, or to act in ways that lifted others. Later in the year, another major global event was held in the same hall. People wondered if the atmosphere would be different this time. When the event began, the hall was quiet. Cameras focused once again on the empty Earth seat. But the silence did not feel heavy or confusing anymore. It felt respectful, almost like the world was listening to something that could not be heard with ears. This time, instead of one or two people standing up, the entire hall felt more peaceful. Discussions were calmer, and the event went smoother than anyone expected. People carried the awareness of the seat within them. They understood what it meant now. It reminded them that humanity could rise without waiting for approval from anyone else. After the event, the researchers stepped outside into the soft evening light. They watched people leaving the hall, elders walking slowly, young adults chatting quietly, workers cleaning the steps, reporters packing their cameras. All of them were part of the same world, all connected by the silent understanding that the Earth seat SYBOLISED as the sky turned orange. A gentle thought crossed the researchers' mind. They realized that the seat did not need to be filled because it was already carried inside millions of people. The real change was not in the hall, but in the hearts of those who had decided to believe in themselves. The story closes with the simple truth. The researcher carried with them everywhere they went. The Earth seat stayed vacant because humanity finally understood something beautiful. People did not need anyone's permission to do good, to rise, or to care for each other. The world had always been waiting for ordinary people to realize that their voice mattered. Once they understood that, the seat no longer looked empty at all. It looked complete, exactly as it was meant to be.